The year was 2347, and humanity had spread across 12 star systems, without anyone in the galaxy really noticing them. They built colonies on distant worlds and mining stations in asteroid belts, and they kept to themselves as much as possible. The great powers of the galaxy barely knew humans existed, and the ones who did know considered them too small and too weak to matter. Admiral Grace Mitchell stood on the bridge of her carrier ship called the Endurance, and she watched the tactical display with a feeling of dread growing in her stomach. 3 massive warships had just appeared near the human colony of New Portland, and these ships belonged to the Valdori hegemony. The Valdori were a reptilian species that had ruled this part of the galaxy for 10,000 years, and they did not come in peace. Lieutenant Kevin Park sat at the communications station, and he kept trying to contact the alien ships, but they ignored every message he sent. Grace had expected this, because the Valdori never bothered to talk with species they considered inferior. They simply took what they wanted and killed anyone who got in their way. The Valdori operated on a very simple belief that weaker species existed only to serve them or to die. They had come to New Portland to take the human colonists as slaves, and they would do this, because no one had ever stopped them before. Hundreds of civilizations had fallen to the Valdori over thousands of years, and humanity was about to join that long list of victims. Grace ordered her ships into a defensive formation around the evacuation transports. She knew they could not win this fight, but she had to try and protect her people. The human fleet carried plasma weapons that they had purchased from neutral traders, but these weapons were 3 centuries behind what the Valdori used. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. The battle lasted 3 hours, and it was a complete disaster for humanity. The Valdori shields absorbed every shot that the human ships fired, and their weapons cut through human armor like it was made of paper. The Endurance took hit after hit, and Grace felt the ship shudder and groan around her as systems failed one after another. Blood ran down her face from a wound on her head, but she refused to leave the bridge. She watched helplessly as the Valdori boarding parties captured transport after transport. 12,000 colonists were dragged from their ships and loaded onto prison vessels, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The screams of her people would haunt her dreams for years to come. When the Valdori finally jumped away with their cargo of human slaves, Grace sat alone on her damaged bridge and made a promise to herself. She swore that this would never happen again, and that humanity would find a way to fight back. She ordered her crew to send a message to Earth Command and to tell them everything that had happened at New Portland on Earth. The news hit like a bomb. President Daniel Cooper called an emergency meeting of the United Terran Council, and every leader who attended the meeting carried the same look of shock and anger on their face. The images from New Portland played on screens around the room, showing human families being torn apart and loaded onto alien slave ships. Defense Secretary Maria Santos stood to address the council, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking with rage. She explained that the Valdori had done this to dozens of other species throughout their history. Most of those species no longer existed because the Valdori worked them to death or simply exterminated them when they were no longer useful. General Nathan Cole was the commander of all human military forces, and he presented a grim assessment of their situation. Human technology was 300 years behind the galactic standard, and their weapons could not penetrate Valdori shields. Their ships were slower and weaker and less numerous than the enemy fleet. By every measure that mattered, humanity was helpless. The room fell silent as the weight of this information settled on everyone present. Some of the leaders looked defeated already and whispered about surrender or negotiation. Perhaps they could offer the Valdori something else in exchange for being left alone. Perhaps there was some deal they could make. Then Dr. Lisa Morgan stood up and everyone turned to look at her. She was the chief of the Advanced Research Division, and she had a reputation for solving impossible problems. She walked to the display screen and uploaded her own presentation, and what appeared made several people gasp. The image showed a long, sleek warship unlike anything humanity had ever built. Massive coils ran along the entire length of the ship, and the design looked brutal and powerful. This was not a ship built for exploration or trade. This was a ship built for one purpose only, and that purpose was destruction. Lisa explained her idea in simple terms that everyone could understand. She told them about kinetic weapons, and specifically about electromagnetic railguns. The galaxy had abandoned projectile weapons thousands of years ago because energy shields could stop them so easily. But her team had studied captured Valdori shield technology, and they had discovered something incredible. The shields that protected Valdori ships were designed to disperse energy. They could absorb laser fire and plasma bolts all day long without any trouble. But they were not designed to stop physical objects traveling at extreme speeds. A metal slug fired from a railgun at a fraction of light speed would carry so much force that the shields simply could not handle. Lisa showed a simulation of what would happen when a railgun slug hit a shielded Valdori ship. The slug punched right through the shield and tore into the hull behind it. The damage was catastrophic and immediate. One shot from a railgun could do what 100 plasma bolts could not. President Cooper leaned forward in his chair and asked the question that everyone was thinking. He wanted to know how long it would take to build these new ships and get them ready for combat. Lisa told him that if humanity mobilized every resource they had, then they could have a fleet ready in 5 years. 5 years was a long time, and the Valdori might attack again before then. But it was also the only hope humanity had of ever being able to defend itself. The president looked around the room at the faces of his advisors, and he saw the same determination in their eyes that he felt in his own heart. He stood and addressed the council with words that would go down in human history. He declared that humanity would build these ships, and that they would mobilize every factory and shipyard and resource they possessed. They would work day and night for 5 years, and at the end of that time, they would have a fleet that could fight back. The Valdori thought that humans were prey to be hunted and enslaved. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Humanity was going to war, and this time they would not lose. Maria Santos asked what they should call this secret project, and President Cooper thought for a moment before answering. He said they would call it Project Defiance because that was exactly what they were doing. They were defying the fate that the galaxy had planned for them, and they would never surrender. The meeting ended, and the leaders returned to their homes to begin the greatest construction project in human history. In secret shipyards hidden throughout the solar system, workers would soon begin building the weapons that would change everything. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, and that was exactly how humanity wanted it. Grace Mitchell received word of the decision while recovering from her injuries in a hospital on Mars. She smiled for the first time since New Portland, and she promised herself that she would be there when humanity finally struck back. The Valdori had made a terrible mistake when they attacked her people. They had awakened something dangerous, and now they would pay the price. The clock started ticking, and humanity began to arm for war. For 5 long years, humanity worked in complete secret, and the great powers of the galaxy never suspected a thing. The Valdori hegemony continued their raids on smaller species, and the Keth Collective expanded their territory, and the ancient Morvani Empire watched everything with cold indifference. None of them paid any attention to the insignificant humans. Deep in the asteroid belts of the Sol system, something incredible was taking shape. Massive construction platforms floated in the darkness between rocks, and on these platforms, workers assembled the first generation of Railgun battleships. The work continued around the clock with 3 shifts of workers rotating. Through every day and every night, the first ship to be completed was christened the Defiance, and she was the most powerful weapon humanity had ever created. Her hull was covered in thick armor plating, and her spine was lined with enormous magnetic acceleration coils. She carried no energy weapons at all because she did not need them. Instead, she mounted row after row of railgun turrets, and her magazines held thousands of tungsten carbide. Penetrator rounds. Captain Samuel Hayes walked the corridors of the Defiance on her first test flight, and he felt the rumble of her massive reactors through the deck beneath his feet. This ship was nothing like the carriers and cruisers he had commanded before. She was a predator built for one purpose, and that purpose was to kill enemy warships. His executive officer, Commander Diana Price, walked beside him, and she reported on the mood of the crew. Most of them had lost family members at New Portland or in the raids that followed. They carried grief and anger in their hearts, and they channeled those feelings into their training. These were not just soldiers doing a job. These were people fighting for revenge. Samuel told her that he wanted the crew angry and focused, because they would need every bit of that intensity when the time came. They had one chance to show the galaxy that humanity was not prey to be hunted. If they failed, then everything they had built would be destroyed, and their species would face extinction in the firing range deep inside the ship. Gunnery Chief Victor Reyes was drilling his weapons crews over and over again. The railgun systems were simple in theory, but incredibly demanding in practice. Each turret could fire a 10-kilogram metal slug at 12% of the speed of light. At that velocity, the projectile would reach its target almost instantly. After being fired, Victor watched his crew complete another training exercise and checked his stopwatch. 3 seconds from target lock to impact was not good enough. The Voldori would not give them 3 seconds to aim and fire. They needed to be faster and more precise. He ordered them to run the drill again, and they would keep running it until they got it right. The training was brutal and exhausting, but no one complained. Everyone on the Defiance understood what was at stake, and they pushed themselves harder than they had ever pushed before. Some of them had nightmares about New Portland, and they used those nightmares as fuel to make themselves better. Wow. The secret fleet grew larger. The Voldori conducted 3 more raids on human colonies. Each time, the human ships retreated without fighting and let the enemy take what they wanted. It was humiliating and painful, but it was necessary. They could not risk revealing their new weapons before the fleet was ready. The Voldori commanders grew more contemptuous with each successful raid. They laughed about how the humans ran away like frightened animals, and they bragged about the slaves they captured. Clearly, these pathetic creatures had learned their place in the natural order. They were prey, and they would always be prey. Admiral Grace Mitchell had recovered fully from her injuries, and she now commanded the entire secret fleet. She watched the Voldori raids from her headquarters on Luna, and she burned with hatred for the aliens who had killed and enslaved so many of her people. But she forced herself to be patient because striking too early would ruin everything. By the end of the 5th year, humanity had built 42 railgun battleships, along with hundreds of smaller escort ships and carriers. It was still a tiny force compared to what the great powers could field. That did not matter. What mattered was that their weapons worked, and the enemy had no idea what was coming. Intelligence officers had identified the next Voldori target, and it was a colony called Havens Rest, where 50,000 humans lived peaceful lives. The enemy fleet would arrive with 8 heavy cruisers and enough transport ships to carry away the entire population. It was the largest raid they had ever attempted against human space. Grace called her senior officers together for a final briefing before the fleet deployed. She stood before them with steel in her eyes and told them that this was the moment they had been waiting for. 5 years of secret work and painful sacrifice had led to this single point in time. She explained that it was not enough to simply win the coming battle. They needed to win so completely and so devastatingly that no one in the galaxy would ever consider attacking humanity again. They needed to make an example that would echo through history. The Voldori had to be crushed so thoroughly that their destruction would serve as a warning. To every other power captain, Samuel Hayes sat in the front row, and he felt a cold calm settle over him. He had trained for this moment for 5 years, and he was ready. His ship was ready. His crew was ready. The Defiance would lead the attack, and they would show the galaxy what humans were capable of. The fleet departed from their hidden bases in the asteroid belt, and they traveled through space toward Haven's Rest. They moved in complete silence with all communications locked down and all systems running dark. The Voldori had no idea that death was coming for them. Diana Price stood on the bridge of the Defiance as they approached the ambush point. She looked at the tactical display showing the positions of all 42 battleships, and she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt hope. For the first time since this nightmare began, she actually believed they might survive. Victor Reyes was in the main gun battery, running one final check on all systems. His crews were at their stations, and every railgun was loaded and ready. The weapons hummed with contained power, just waiting to be unleashed. He thought about his sister, who had been taken in one of the early raids, and he promised her ghost that today he would have his revenge. The fleet reached Haven's Rest and took up hidden positions behind the colony's small moon. They powered down their engines and waited in the darkness like wolves preparing to strike. Somewhere out there, the Voldori fleet was approaching, completely unaware of the trap that had been set for them. Admiral Grace Mitchell sat in her command chair aboard the flagship, and she allowed herself a small smile. The enemy thought they were coming to harvest helpless prey. They had no idea that the prey had grown fangs. In a few hours, the galaxy would learn that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. The waiting was the hardest part, but they had been waiting for 5 years already. A few more hours meant nothing. When the Voldori arrived, they would find something they had never encountered before. They would find humans who were ready and willing and able to fight back. Samuel Hayes looked at the stars through the bridge view screen and thought about everyone who had died to bring them to this moment. The colonists at New Portland and all the other victims of Voldori cruelty would finally be avenged. Their sacrifice would not be in vain. The trap was set, and now they waited for their prey to arrive. The Voldori fleet dropped out of hyperspace near Haven's Rest, and Warlord Kessex stood on the bridge of his flagship called the Dominant Will. He was a veteran of 100 slave raids, and this mission would be no different from all the others. The humans would run, and his warriors would chase them down and capture them. He glanced at the tactical display with bored eyes and saw exactly what he expected to see. Human ships were fleeing toward the outer reaches of the star system, just like they always did. These weak creatures had learned their lesson well, and they knew better than to stand and fight against their betters. Kessex ordered his fleet to pursue and capture the fleeing ships. He wanted the colony transports taken intact because the slave markets were paying premium prices for human workers. The creatures were small and weak, but they were clever with their hands, and they made good laborers in the mines and factories. His 8 heavy cruisers accelerated toward the retreating human vessels with their weapons powered down and their shields running at minimum strength. There was no need for combat readiness against such pathetic opponents. This would be another easy victory to add to his already impressive record. The Voldori crews relaxed at their stations, and some of them even joked about what they would buy with their share of the slave profits. None of them noticed the 42 battleships emerging from behind Haven's Rest small moon. By the time the sensors detected the new contacts, it was already far too late. On the bridge of the Defiance, Captain Samuel Hayes watched the enemy fleet cruise into weapons range. The Voldori were coming straight at them without any attempt to maneuver or spread out. They were so confident in their superiority that they had not even raised their shields to full power. Admiral Grace Mitchell's voice crackled over the fleet communication channel, and she spoke 2 words that would change history. She said, "Weapons free," and those words released 5 years of preparation and anger and determination. The moment humanity had been waiting for had finally arrived. Samuel turned to his gunnery officer and told him to light up the enemy fleet. Victor Reyes had been waiting for this command his entire career, and he gave the order to fire with fierce joy in his voice. The Defiant shuddered as her main batteries discharged, and 8 railgun turrets hurled their deadly projectiles into the void. Each slug accelerated down the magnetic coils and reached 12% of light speed in less than a heartbeat. At that velocity, the metal projectiles carried more kinetic energy than nuclear weapons. They crossed the distance to the enemy fleet in seconds, and they hit their targets with devastating force. Across the human fleet, hundreds of railguns fired in a single coordinated volley. The darkness of space lit up with the flash of weapons discharge, and thousands of tungsten slugs raced toward the Voldori ships. It was the largest display of firepower humanity had ever unleashed, and it was absolutely beautiful. Warlord Kessex had exactly 1.3 seconds to understand what was happening before the first slug punched through his flagship shields. The shields that had protected Voldori ships for thousands of years simply collapsed against the kinetic assault. They were designed to stop energy weapons, not solid objects moving at relativistic speeds. The dominant will's forward section ceased to exist as the railgun slug tore through it. Metal vaporized instantly from the impact energy, and the ship broke apart in an expanding cloud of debris and fire. Kessex died without truly understanding what had killed him, and his last thought was confusion rather than fear. The other Voldori ships suffered the same fate in rapid succession. Cruisers that had terrorized 100 worlds were torn to pieces in seconds. Their shields offered no protection, and their armor might as well have been made of paper. The railgun slugs went through them like needles through cloth. One Voldori ship managed to survive long enough to attempt an emergency hyperspace jump. The crew was desperately trying to escape and warn the hegemony about this new threat. But a railgun slug caught them mid-transition, and the interaction between the projectile and the hyperspace field created an explosion that briefly outshone the Star Commander. Diana Price stared at the tactical display and could not believe what she was seeing. She read the numbers out loud in a voice filled with wonder. The engagement had lasted 47 seconds from first shot to last target destroyed. Enemy casualties were total, with not a single ship escaping. Human casualties were 0 around her. The bridge crew sat in stunned silence despite all their training and preparation. They had won a battle against the most feared military power in the galaxy, and they had done it without losing a single ship. Some of them started laughing, and others started crying, and some did both at the same time. Victor Reyes stood in the gun battery surrounded by his cheering crews, and he thought about his sister. Wherever she was in the galaxy, he hoped she could somehow know that her people had finally struck back. The Voldori would never again raid human colonies without fear in their hearts. Admiral Grace Mitchell appeared on the main view screen, and her expression was grim but satisfied. She ordered all ships to secure from battle stations, and she dispatched search and rescue teams to look for any survivors among the wreckage. They would need prisoners to tell the story of what happened here. Diana asked if there would be any survivors, given the complete destruction of the enemy fleet. Grace replied that they would search anyway, because the galaxy needed to know that humans were not monsters. They would show mercy to any enemies who survived, even though the Voldori had never shown mercy to anyone. Samuel Hayes walked to the view screen and looked out at the debris field that had once been 8 heavy cruisers. Somewhere in that wreckage were the bodies of warriors who had thought themselves invincible. They had learned a hard lesson today about the danger of underestimating your enemies. Grace continued speaking to the entire fleet, and she reminded them that this was only the first battle. The Voldori hegemony would not accept this defeat quietly, and they would send a much larger force to avenge their fallen warriors. Humanity needed to be ready for what was coming next, but for now they would celebrate this victory because they had earned it. 5 years of secret work and sacrifice had paid off in 47 seconds of absolute destruction. The galaxy would soon learn that humanity was no longer prey to be hunted. Teams combed through the wreckage for hours, but they found no survivors. The railgun slugs had been too thorough and too devastating. A few escape pods were recovered, but they contained only bodies killed by the violent destruction of their ship. Samuel ordered his crew to stand down and rest because they would need their strength for the battles ahead. He walked through the corridors of the Defiance and saw the faces of his people shining with pride and joy. They had done something that no one in the galaxy thought was possible. Diana found him in his quarters, staring at a picture of his parents who had died at New Portland. She asked if he was all right, and he said that he would be once the war was truly over. Today they had won a battle, but the war was just beginning. The Valdori would come back with everything they had. Grace Mitchell sent a message to Earth reporting the complete success of the operation. President Daniel Cooper received the news with profound relief, and he ordered celebrations across all human worlds. For the first time in 5 years, humanity had something to celebrate, but even as the parties began, the leaders knew that the real test was still coming. The Valdori would respond with overwhelming force, and humanity would have to face them again. The secret was out now, and there was no going back. The galaxy knew that humans had claws, and they would never forget it. Battle of Haven's Rest was over, and humanity had won its first real victory against a galactic superpower. But this was only the beginning of a much longer war. The Valdori hegemony was not going to accept this humiliation, and they would return with fire and fury. Samuel Hayes looked at the stars and prepared himself for whatever came next. News of the Battle of Haven's Rest spread across the galaxy faster than anyone expected. Every species with access to communications networks heard about what had happened. The mighty Valdori hegemony, which had not suffered a real military defeat in 3,000 years, had been humiliated by creatures they considered barely more than animals. The Valdori leadership reacted with disbelief at first, and then with burning rage. 8 heavy cruisers destroyed in less than a minute by a species they had dismissed as worthless prey. The recordings from the battle showed their ships being torn apart by weapons they could not understand. This was not just a defeat, it was an embarrassment. Supreme Commander Tharvox was the most decorated officer in the entire history of the hegemony. He had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds and driven entire species to extinction. Now he was given command of the largest war fleet ever, assembled with a simple mission to exterminate humanity. 200 warships gathered at the border of human space, including the massive dreadnoughts that were the pride of the Valdori military. Each dreadnought was larger than anything humans had ever built, and they carried enough firepower to devastate entire planets. This fleet would sweep through human space and leave nothing but ashes behind. Defense Secretary Maria Santos delivered the intelligence report to the Terran Council with a heavy heart. The Valdori were coming, and they were bringing everything they had. She showed images of the enemy fleet, and the room fell silent at the sight of so many warships in one place. General Nathan Cole updated the strategic display to show humanity's current strength. They had 87 Railgun Battleships now, along with escort vessels and support ships. The shipyards had been working non-stop since Haven's Rest, and they had nearly doubled their numbers. But they were still badly outnumbered. Admiral Grace Mitchell spoke up and told the Council that numbers did not matter when your enemy's weapons could not hurt you. The Valdori shields could not stop railgun slugs, and their armor could not withstand the impact. The only question was whether the enemy was smart enough to recognize this before they were all destroyed. President Daniel Cooper asked what the fleet needed to win this battle, and Grace told him they needed permission to engage the enemy in open space. No ambushers this time, and no tricks. Humanity would face the Valdori fleet directly and show the entire galaxy what they were capable of. The Council voted unanimously to authorize the engagement, and Grace began preparing her fleet for the most important battle in human history. If they won, then humanity would be secure, and if they lost, then their species would face extinction. There was no middle ground and no room for failure. The Valdori fleet entered human space at the Kepler's Gate transit point with Supreme Commander Tharvox at its head. He had studied every recording from Haven's Rest, and he understood intellectually what the humans had accomplished. But understanding something and truly believing it were very different things. He ordered all ships to maximum shield power and commanded them to close to energy weapon range. Their strategy was simple and brutal. They would overwhelm the human fleet with sheer volume of fire and destroy them through attrition. 200 ships against 87 should be an easy victory. The Valdori formation advanced with perfect discipline toward the human positions. Their shields blazed with power and their weapons charged to full capacity. They looked magnificent and terrifying and unstoppable. Any other species in the galaxy would have fled at the sight of such a force. The human fleet waited at the edge of the system, and they did not run. 87 railgun battleships held their positions in a defensive formation and waited for the enemy to come to them. On the bridge of the Defiance, Captain Samuel Hayes watched the wall of approaching warships with cold eyes. He observed that the Valdori were not even trying to maneuver, and that they were coming straight at the human fleet in a tight formation. Commander Deanna Price replied that it was arrogance because they still did not truly believe what had happened at Haven's Rest. They would have to learn the hard way. Samuel gave the order for all batteries to fire at will, and the void lit up with destruction. The Defiance shuddered as her railguns discharged and across the human fleet. Hundreds of other weapons added their fire to the barrage. Thousands of tungsten slugs raced toward the enemy at 12% of light speed. Tharvox watched his dreadnoughts die around him one after another. The shields that were supposed to be impenetrable collapsed instantly against the kinetic assault. The armor that was supposed to be unbreakable tore like wet paper. His ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light as their reactors went critical. The energy weapons of the Valdori fleet could not even target the human ships effectively. The railgun battleships stood off at extreme range, far beyond the reach of enemy guns. They could hit the Valdori from distances that made return fire impossible. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The human fleet paused twice during the engagement to allow their railgun capacitors to recharge. Each time the firing stopped, the surviving Valdori ships tried desperately to close the distance. Each time the firing resumed, they died in droves before they could get any closer. Tharvox refused to retreat, even as his fleet was torn apart around him. Pride and rage drove him forward, even when any rational commander would have ordered a withdrawal. He believed that if he could just get close enough, his remaining ships could overwhelm the humans with numbers. His flagship took a direct hit to the bridge, and in his final moments, Tharvox felt something, like respect for the creatures who had killed him. They had outhawed and outfought the greatest military power in the galaxy. They deserved their victory, even if he hated to admit it. The second battle of Kepler's Gate lasted 18 minutes, and it ended with the complete destruction of the Valdori fleet. Not a single enemy ship escaped, and the few survivors floating in the wreckage were too few to matter. Human casualties were 3 ships damaged and 0 destroyed. The Valdori hegemony surrendered 3 days later because they had no fleet left to fight with. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. They would release all human prisoners immediately. They would pay reparations for the colonies they had raided. They would accept human observers to ensure compliance, but the end of the war with the Valdori brought new problems for humanity. The other great powers of the galaxy had watched the battles with growing alarm. The Keth Collective and the ancient Morvani Empire had seen their rival humiliated. They wondered what humans might do to them. Ambassador Richard Lane represented humanity at the Galactic Council, and he faced a room full of hostile alien delegates. The Keth representative accused humans of using barbaric weapons that violated ancient conventions. Kinetic projectiles were considered uncivilized by species that had moved beyond such primitive technology. Richard replied calmly and asked if kinetic weapons were more barbaric than slavery. He asked if they were more barbaric than the extermination of helpless colonies. Humanity had not started this war, but they had certainly finished it, and they would not apologize for defending themselves. The Morvani delegate spoke slowly with the weight of ages behind his words. He said that humanity had upset the balance of power that had kept the galaxy stable for thousands of years. This could have dangerous consequences for everyone. Richard looked the ancient being directly in the eyes and told him that the old peace had been built on the suffering of weaker species. Humanity offered a different kind of peace where strength was not the only thing that mattered. The chamber fell silent because no one had spoken to the Morvani like that in 10,000 years. Great powers did not know what to do about humanity, and that uncertainty was more valuable than any fleet. They could not attack without risking destruction, and they could not ignore a species that had just defeated one of their own. Humanity had earned a seat at the table, whether the others liked it or not. Grace Mitchell watched the diplomatic proceedings from her headquarters and allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. They had won the war, and now they were winning the peace. But she knew that the real work was just beginning. Having power was one thing, and using it wisely was something else entirely. The galaxy had changed forever, and humanity had changed it. 5 years had passed since the Valdori surrender, and the galaxy looked completely different than it had before. Humanity had built alliances with dozens of smaller species that had lived in fear of the great powers for generations. Together, they formed the Terran Coalition, and it represented a new force in galactic politics. These were civilizations that had been bullied and exploited and threatened with extinction for thousands of years. They came to humanity seeking protection, and humanity welcomed them with open arms. The coalition grew stronger with each new member, and the great powers watched with increasing unease. Admiral Grace Mitchell had retired from active service, and she lived in a quiet apartment on Luna with a view of the Earth below. She had spent her entire career fighting, and now she finally had time to rest. But she still watched the news and kept track of what was happening in the galaxy. A visitor arrived at her door one evening, and Grace was surprised to see Dr. Lisa Morgan standing there. Lisa had aged considerably since they first met, and the weight of her creation still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had come to talk about something that had been bothering her for years. Lisa sat by the window and looked at the stars. While she spoke, she wondered out loud if they had done the right thing by building the Railgun fleet. They had created the deadliest weapons the galaxy had ever seen, and that knowledge would never go away. Other species would learn to build their own railguns eventually. Grace considered the question carefully before answering. She said they had built those weapons to protect their people and to give humanity a chance to survive. Without the railguns, their species would have been enslaved or exterminated. There had been no other choice. Lisa acknowledged this truth, but she pointed out that humanity was now a superpower. They were one of the great empires of the galaxy, whether they wanted to be or not. Power like that came with responsibilities and dangers that were hard to predict. Grace replied that humanity was not an empire because they did not want to conquer anyone. They only wanted to live in peace and protect the species that had joined their coalition. That was different from what the Valdori and the others had done. Lisa looked at her old friend with sad eyes and reminded her that the Valdori had not started out as tyrants either. 10,000 years ago, they were just another young species fighting for survival. Power had corrupted them over the centuries, and the same thing could happen to humanity on the Defiance, which was now the flagship of the entire Terran defense. Fleet Captain Samuel Hayes was preparing for his final voyage before retirement. He would lead a diplomatic mission to the Morvani homeworld. as the first human delegation ever invited to that ancient civilization commander. Diana Price was about to become Captain Price and take command of the Defiance. She stood beside Samuel on the bridge and talked about what the Morvani might want from this meeting. They had been watching humanity for 5 years, and they had seen how humans treated their allies. The Morvani had witnessed countless species rise to power through brutality and conquest over their long history. Humanity was something different because they had risen through being attacked, and they had become stronger by defending others. The ancient empire was curious about these strange, new creatures. Samuel nodded slowly and said that was the humanity he believed in. Not the railguns and not the battleships, but the idea that strength should protect rather than destroy. If they could hold on to that principle, then they might avoid becoming the monsters they had fought against. The diplomatic mission was a complete success, and the Morvani agreed to establish formal relations with humanity. For the first time in recorded history, the ancient empire acknowledged a younger species as an equal. It was a moment of triumph that no one had thought possible just 10 years before. But the true test of humanity's new role came 6 months later when a Keth collective fleet attacked the Valdori border colony. The Keth expected easy pickings from there. Weakened former rival, and they came with enough ships to overwhelm the few defenses that remained. The Valdori had been stripped of most of their military power by treaty, and they could not defend themselves. They faced extermination at the hands of enemies who wanted revenge for centuries of Valdori domination. The irony was not lost on anyone who remembered what the Valdori had done to others. President Daniel Cooper called an emergency session of the Terran Coalition Council to decide what to do. Some delegates argued that they should let the Keth have their revenge. The Valdori had enslaved human colonists and killed innocent people, and they deserved whatever happened to them. Ambassador Richard Lane stood and addressed the council with passion in his voice. He said that if they abandoned the Valdori, then they were no better than the Valdori themselves. The coalition had been built on a promise of protection, and that promise had to mean something even when it was hard. The vote was close, but in the end, the ZU coalition fleet deployed to help their former enemies. 40 Railgun battleships jumped to Valdori space and positioned themselves between the Keth armada and the helpless colony. The Keth commander had seen the recordings from Kepler's Gate, and he knew what those ships could do. The Keth fleet withdrew without firing a single shot, and the Valdori colony was saved. It was a bloodless victory that proved something important about humanity. They had the power to destroy, but they also had the wisdom to show mercy. Strength and compassion could exist together. Grace Mitchell received news of the bloodless victory at her home on Luna, and she smiled. She poured herself a drink and raised a silent toast to the stars. Humanity had done something that she had not been sure was possible. They had become powerful without becoming cruel. She thought about all the people who had sacrificed to bring them to this moment. The colonists at New Portland who had died so that humanity would wake up and fight back. The workers who had built the fleet in secret for 5 years. The soldiers who had risked everything in battle. Lysa Morgan had worried that power would corrupt humanity, the way it had corrupted so many species before. But today proved that humans were capable of something different. They could be strong and still be kind. They could win wars and still seek peace. Samuel Hayes retired to a small farm on a quiet colony world where he could see the stars at night. Diana Price took command of the Defiance and continued to serve with honor. Grace Mitchell wrote her memoirs, and they became required reading at every military academy in the coalition. The galaxy was still dangerous, and there would be more conflicts in the future. Old powers would test the coalition, and new threats would emerge from the unknown reaches of space. Humanity would face challenges that no one could predict. But for the first time in their history, humans looked at the stars without fear. They had fought for their place in the galaxy, and they had won it. Not through conquest or cruelty, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to be victims. When the universe had tried to break them, they'd have become stronger instead. When they had gained power, they had used it to protect others. Victor Reyes became an instructor at the Fleet Academy, and he taught a new generation of gunners how to operate the railgun systems. He told his students about the battles he had fought and the friends he had lost. He made sure they understood that their weapons were tools for protection, not domination. Maria Santos served 3 more terms as VA's defense secretary before retiring to write books about strategy and leadership. Nathan Cole became the head of the Coalition Military Academy. Richard Lane continued to represent humanity at the Galactic Council for another 20 years. The Terran Coalition grew to include over 100 member species, and it became the largest alliance in galactic history. They built schools and hospitals and trading posts across thousands of worlds. They defended the weak and stood up to the strong and never forgot where they came from, and in the end, that was the most human thing of all. They had been prey, and they had become protectors. They had been weak, and they had become strong. They had faced extinction, and they had survived. The galaxy would never forget the day that humanity armed for war and won. The stars belong to everyone now.